it's Suzanne Crowley, and I'm going to read to you today from my middle grade novel, Finding Esme, which is about a 12-year-old girl who finds dinosaur bones on her family's Texas peach farm. But first, I thought I'd tell you about some of the inspirations behind my works, because that's the biggest question I get from readers is, where do you get your ideas? And so here's my advice. Write what you know and write what you're curious about. I apparently was a very curious little girl. Here I am with a book in hand, and apparently I was always reading and curious about many things. I was from a family of storytellers. My father and my grandmother, native Texans, always had tall tales about growing up in Texas. So I was very inspired by their stories. And as a little girl even, I started to write stories down. I tried to make them into books. And here's some of them. Cuddles, about a little puppy, and The Turtle Taxi, which was based on a little toy I had, and The Independent Dodo Bird, and Flower Pig, which was based on a piggy bank that my grandmother had painted for me. So these books even had a little logo on the back. I was very determined that they would look like real books. And then eventually I graduated into chapter books and typed them on a typewriter. And here's one called The Return, which is about scary things that happen when the red moon comes out. And this one even has over 100 pages, and I was very proud of myself that I'd written a story so long. But I also was inspired by lots of other things when I was growing up. I played with horned toads, which were all over the place when I was a little girl in Texas, and they're actually not frogs or toads, although they look like them with this round tummy, but they're actually lizards. And they've got a frill of horns on their head, is why we call them horny toads. And they're actually very rare today. They're on the endangered species list. But luckily, there are several zoos and scientists that are doing hatchling programs and are hoping to reintroduce many more out into the wild. So hopefully we'll start seeing more of these in Texas. Another thing that inspired Finding Esme was my love of fossils and rocks. And I had a huge rock collection in fossils, which I don't have anymore, but I still have this rock, which is a beautiful amethyst, which we got on a driving trip to Arkansas as a little girl. We passed a rock show on the side of the road, and I begged my parents to stop, and they bought me this rock. I also had a little bit of a fossil collection. I was about 10 years old and discovered a dry riverbed at the back of our neighborhood. This was in Austin, Texas at the time. And there were dozens and dozens of fossilized shells that I collected. Apparently, this dry riverbed in this area had been an ocean hundreds of millions of years ago. I sure wish I had those fossils, but I don't have them anymore. Other things that inspired Finding Esme. I have a family of beekeepers in my family, and in Finding Esme, Bee Macaulay, the grandmother, is a beekeeper and sells the honey from the bees to make extra money. And that becomes a sweet and sour becomes kind of a major metaphor through Finding Esme. And apparently my great-grandfather, Oscar Oliver Saunders, who here he is, was a beekeeper around the turn of the century, and by turn of the century, I mean 1900s, in North Texas, and then later kept bees in West Texas. And there was also a great uncle in the family that was a beekeeper. So I was very inspired by these beekeepers and put them in Finding Esme. A quick fact about honeybees in Texas around the 1900s, farmers had to make extra money because there was a lot of droughts in Texas, and there were over 150,000 honeybee colonies in Texas. That's hard to believe, but there's still a lot of honeybees in Texas, and a lot of beekeepers that sell their honey, which you can find at the grocery store. Another story growing up that made its way into Finding Esme was kind of an urban legend in the family, and it's about my grandmother, whose name was Edith Saunders, and she was born in 1908, and here she is. And there was a story about her living through a tornado. And I did some research and discovered that this was called the Dixie tornado outbreak that happened in 1908, and it went across over several days, several southern states, and over 300 people were killed. So what happened to my grandmother, the story goes that her mother, Ida Mae, saw the tornado coming and ushered the children inside as fast as she could. And she was trying to make it to my grandmother, who was asleep in a bassinet, 3 months old. And as the tornado went over the house, my great-grandmother hit her head in the frameway of the door and was knocked unconscious. And when she woke up, she made her way to my grandmother in the bassinet, and she was still asleep. She had slept through the tornado. It was like a miracle and was totally unscathed. And for the rest of her life, my grandmother was kidded by her siblings that she was one tough cookie who had slept through a tornado. So that story makes it into Finding Esme. You'll just have to read to see how that story changes in my book. So that's some of the inspirations about growing up in Texas that made their way into Finding Esme. And so now I thought I'd read a little bit from the book. And this is a crucial point when our main character, Esme Macaulay, starts digging up the dinosaur. A cold wind, the kind that tells you the rain is leaving, started to blow as Bo and I ran through the orchard chasing fireflies. Bee said the fireflies were disappearing more and more every summer, and it made me sad. At the base of Solace Hill, the buzzing started in my feet again. I ignored it as I peered at the gentle pinpricks of rain on the sweet clover. The clover grew in clumps up the hill, surrounded by butter-colored stumps of jutting stone. Bo ran ahead of me, laughing as he reached for the elusive fireflies who would dance just out of his grasp. I ran after him, but old Jack stayed behind, stiff as a sentinel, a low growl emitting every now and then from his throat. It was just a moment later that I tripped over something hard, a rock that hadn't been there before, because I knew every inch of that hill, like I knew the back of my hand, like I knew every foot of Peach Hollow Farm. Pap's tractor must have churned it up, and the rain must have unveiled it. I blinked, the wind knocked out of me from the fall, and my nose throbbing from landing face first on rocky earth. Something dripped from my hand, blood. I'd given myself a bloody nose. I started to stand up just as I saw a shape. I stood back in awe. It wasn't a rock. I leaned down and peered at it closer, holding my hand up to my bleeding nose. A bone. Not a stone or a rock, it was a bone. I stood up quickly, my heart dropping to my feet. Paps? Oh God, Harlan? Could it be my daddy? I stood stock still, shivers going up and down my spine, staring at that bone. Then I turned and chased Bo back down the hill after the fireflies. Like ghost embers in the dark they were. So that's the crucial point where Esme first starts digging up the bone, and she also unearths family secrets too in Finding Esme. So I thought I'd leave you with several pieces of advice if you want to become a writer. First of all, you have to read. To become a good writer, you learn the most from other good writers. You learn about pacing, plotting, characterization, word choice, structure, and mainly voice. What makes a good voice in a narrative? That's where you're going to learn it, is by reading as many books as you can. And then next is, to become a good writer, you have to write. I can't say this enough. You have to practice to become a good writer. And then, of course, you have to rewrite. That's where the magic happens, is in revision. And then again, like I said at the beginning, write what you're curious about. Write what you're passionate about. Write what you want to know more about. And that is what will add the magic and the pizzazz to your writing. So good luck, and I enjoyed chatting with you today. Thanks.